Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. It's a big question. Earlier on, we heard that the US's approach towards Iran, well, we heard that Iran has been a problem, but also that the US's approach to Iran has not worked. I would actually say that there has been one approach that only has been pursued for a very brief period of time that actually yielded results. And that is the negotiations that took place over the JCPOA. It's the only time the United States has managed to change a core Iranian national security policy. Everything else the United States has tried has raised the cost for whatever the Iranians have been doing, but without succeeding in changing what they're doing. The JCPOA is the only time that we managed to get them to back off. We managed to get them to compromise. And unfortunately, afterwards, the Trump administration pulled out of the deal, and now we're back to not square one, we're actually at -1. Because what happened as a result of the US pulling out is that it destroyed much of the confidence the very little confidence that existed in terms of a belief on the Iranian side that their compromises would yield sustainable compromises on the American side. There is a strong belief in Iran now that the United States simply is incapable of offering sustained sanctions relief. And that belief is very dangerous because it neutralizes the leverage the United States has. Sanctions are supposed to, at least technically, be a leverage that is used in order to be able to elicit compromises from the Iranian side. But that necessitates that the other side believes that we are willing, capable to be able to lift those sanctions. Given what has happened, they're now left with that impression that we're not, that the political will does not exist on the American side to be able to sustain such an approach. And this is, of course, made worse by the fact that the Biden administration failed to get back into the JCPOA, even though they had a very significant opportunity to do so right at the beginning of Biden's term. So now we're in a situation that is much, much worse than before. Also take a look at what happened, how the world looked like in 2013 to 2015 at the core height of the JCPOA negotiations. We were still in a world in which the United States was the gatekeeper for who is in and who is out in the community of nations. The United States essentially could decide with very significant compliance of other countries, which country is a rogue state, which country is a pariah, which country is not. We are now much more in a world that is characterized by greater multipolarity. New blocs are being formed, BRICS, et cetera, et cetera. The United States, by and large, has lost the ability to be able to say who is in and who is out because the world is no longer such that the United States controls that degree of economic and other forms of development. This is also a major loss of leverage for the US because that was actually a very critical thing for the Iranians. They wanted to get out of their pariah status. They wanted to, not because of any love for the United States, but because of the necessity for their own development. And making some form of a compromise with the United States under those circumstances was a necessity in order to be able to get out of that status. Today, given how the world looks like, they're shifting towards Russia, they're shifting towards China, and are feeling more comfortable doing so, and feeling that even without sanctions relief from the United States, even without any effort by the United States to come to some form of agreement, that they simply can get by. Whether that is true or not, whether they're right or wrong, remains to be seen, but it is a perception that is there, that is very strongly held, which is as a result of history, as you pointed out, which creates a much, much more challenging situation when it comes to how to deal with Iran. One last point before I hand it over to the other panelists. It is fascinating to me that when you take a look at the debate in the early 1990s to mid-1990s, 94, 95, when the United States, under the Clinton administration, decided to really embark on a sanctions strategy towards Iran. Of course, there had been sanctions on Iran after the Iranian Revolution in the 1980s, but by 1994, trade between Iran and the US actually stood at $4 billion, which in those numbers actually was quite significant. This was overwhelmingly the Iranians buying cereals and other things from the United States. The US wasn't buying much from Iran. But nevertheless, there was some trade. But the Clinton administration, through 2 executive orders, killed that. There was a bit of a debate in the US at the time of what this would do. And one argument in particular was made by several different columnists, which was that if we choose to go down this path of just sanctioning Iran completely, all we will do is to push Iran deeper into Russia and China's orbit. 30 plus years afterwards, I think it's quite clear that that argument unfortunately bore out to be quite true.
Okay, so sort of picking off of where we left off in the conversation. Part of the, what we've seen happen in the past, especially since Trump pulled out of the JCPOA and the maximum pressure sanctions that he put on and that the Biden administration has continued, there are a few things that have been solidified into place. One is an understanding, as Trita was mentioning, that sanctions do not come off. And one of the things that actually those who are very close to the Revolutionary Guard and to the governing elites within the Islamic Republic, through their various sorts of think tanks and institutes, they study quite closely is the case of Serbia. And they point to the case of Serbia as saying that this is a case in which sanctions were put on, and even when Milosevic had left power, it took a very long time for sanctions to be lifted because the goalpost at which Serbia had to meet for those sanctions to be lifted was one that kept moving. And so from their calculations, because of their experiences of what happened when Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, as well as their understanding of how US sanctions work, they've come to the conclusion that when you come under US sanctions, you don't get off of US sanctions. And so their strategic calculus has become that you create and you solidify ways of trade that bypass the ability of US sanctions to do much damage. Now, US sanctions, you know, we just finished writing a book about US sanctions, and I think the question that's often asked in Washington is, do sanctions work? And I think that that's actually the wrong question to ask, because of course sanctions work. When you have a country with the size of the United States putting sanctions on other countries, there are things that happen within that society's economy, within that society's political culture, etc. But one of the things that we found in connection to Iran and specifically, and now I'm leading another set of research projects with scholars who are looking at pretty much every sanctioned country that the United States is sanctioning at the moment, in differently sort of sanctions, whether it's targeted sanctions, whether they're comprehensive sanctions, different kinds of economies. And one of the things that we're finding is that this is becoming the political calculus sort of across the board, which is that when the United States puts sanctions on, it's very much a stick, and there are very few carrots that allow sanctions to actually be taken off, especially because when you're looking at a country like Iran, the sanctions are spread out across various US agencies. So what the Iranians have done is they have created systems and infrastructures to bypass trade that would come under sanctions. And when Russia came under sanctions, this became an opportunity for them to create trade infrastructure, for example, across the Eurasian terrain now, where trade can happen between Iran and Russia and the neighboring countries in ways that would bypass the ability of the United States sanctions to be able to punish them. But importantly, what this is leading to, and one of, I think, our biggest findings, is that what sanctions are meant to put enough pressure on a targeted society to either force the population to rise up to ask for change, or to put enough pressure on the political elite so that they crumble under that pressure and say, well, we want to stay in power, so we will make certain kinds of concessions in order to stay in power, right? But what the situation in Iran has showed us is that anytime that there have been popular uprisings, and Iran is a country in which there are many popular uprisings that happen, but especially since 2017 onwards, they have become more and more militant. Those popular uprisings are met, especially when sanctions are severely implemented on a country, are met with increasing militarization and securitization on the domestic sphere. But secondly, and this is what's really important, and I think we don't pay enough attention to in Washington, and this is important for Iran, but it's also important now for places like Russia and China, is that when the United States imposes sanctions in these comprehensive ways, It's not like the governing establishments of these countries put their hands in the air and say, well, you know, our bad, let us come back to the negotiation table with you. That's not what ends up happening. Instead, they figure out ways to bust through sanctions. And sanctions busting is something that is extremely, first of all, very costly to do, because all of a sudden trade and goods, you have to pay much higher for the same goods that you would pay, for example, one price, all of a sudden that price gets multiplied by magnitudes, right? So independent businesses end up being iced out of a sanctions busting economy. So what ends up happening in cases like Iran and others is that those entities that are tied to the military and political elites are the ones that end up having the capital to be able to bust through sanctions. Secondly, busting through sanctions means that you need to be able to have control over what goes in and out of the borders. This is why in any comprehensively sanctioned country that you look at, you see over time that the military establishment of that country, their cash holdings begin to skyrocket because they are the ones that control what comes in and out of the country, right? And so what we have seen over time as we have observed this is that the business entities that are tied to the Revolutionary Guard and the Supreme Leader's office in specific, but also those tied to other members of the political elite in Iran, have mushroomed as far as their economic strength in the country is concerned. And when you look at the economic data from 2018, 2019 to today, you are beginning to see a monopolization of the capitalist or like the wealth owning class in the country. It has shifted very drastically into the hands of those who are tied to the Revolutionary Guard and the political establishment, especially tied to the Supreme Leader's office. So then that has created a lot of ripple effects, not only just through the economy, through the culture of the country, through what is supported and not supported through the society, but also then, if we're going to think about, as this leads into the next panel later on today, the ways in which you have to figure that out when it comes to then what it means regionally and what it means to economic strength domestically. Exactly. Right? As the exponential growth of those tied to the Revolutionary Guard and the political establishment in Iran has gone up under sanctions. And again, I'm specifically talking about Iran, but I can show you this analysis in many other sanctioned countries as well, which is why I think we need to think much more critically about sanctions in Washington than we do. But as their economic strength mushrooms, simultaneously, you see a huge decline in not just folks who are within sort of poverty ranges already, but specifically when it comes to Iran. And what's very important here is that you see a very drastic decline in the middle classes. And it's the middle classes that in Iran have always been at the forefront of social and cultural change in Iran. They're the ones that lead the uprisings.
Well, first of all, thank you. Great to be with everybody this morning. I will approach this question as a former practitioner of sanctions. I'm a former terror finance analyst at the US Treasury Department, and I worked this file, among others, during the Bush administration, not as a political appointee, by the way, important distinction. Let me try to answer two questions this morning. The first is whether sanctions work, and then I also want to ask the question, does sanctions relief work? Because I think we talk about these things as if they're not connected or related, and I think it's important to unpack both. Sanctions work because of the power of the US dollar. The dollar is still king for now, whether that changes because of crypto, because of changes in geopolitics, remains to be seen. But for now, the dollar is still the most trusted currency in the world. I'm not sure if we can back that up here at the Treasury today, but so be it. That's where we are. And that may change. But it is our ability to move markets, to engage directly with other central banks, to engage with the individual banks around the world, that ultimately allows us to either welcome people into the system or to block people out. We have immense power. We control the ones and zeros of the modern banking system, the digital banking system that everybody uses today. And when we use that wisely, And sometimes with great strength, we get to see the results. Now, I will be the first to admit that we slap sanctions on a random guy from the Revolutionary Guards, it probably doesn't help. And if we slap sanctions on some drone manufacturer in Iran, it probably doesn't help either. But when we put pressure on the SWIFT banking system, the messaging system that allows all of the banks around the world to communicate with one another and to transfer money back and forth, when we lean on SWIFT to cut off the Iranians from the international system, when the regime finds itself completely isolated, we see how sanctions can work. Because that's exactly what happened. The regime came running to us after those sanctions were imposed, by the way, and not by Trump, by Obama, okay? It's important to note here that the first iteration of maximum pressure, if you will, came during the Obama years in cooperation with Congress, and then we began to see the way that this all took form. And the Iranians came back to us and said, okay, we're ready to talk. That led to the JPOA, the interim deal, and then, of course, ultimately to the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the final one that came in 2015. Our problem was that we used that leverage and then we relinquished it too soon. We had the Iranians at the table and then we began to fork over massive amounts of money. The cash started flowing to the regime, and literally cash, right? We were looking at $100 million or so per month for the 2 years of the interim agreement. And then we yielded the Iranians $150 billion, give or take, in sanctions relief before we got what we wanted from them, which was a complete dismantling of the Iranian nuclear program. And by the way, we didn't ask them to dismantle the terror apparatus that we are now seeing blowing back upon the United States with the money that we gave them. And I can tell you with certainty that some of the funds that we released during the JPOA period, the interim agreement period, flowed to groups like the Houthis. And the Houthis, of course, have shut down the Red Sea passage right now. It's cut off roughly 10% of world trade, driving up costs for our European allies and for other parts of the Middle East. This is how sanctions relief can be incredibly dangerous. Sanctions themselves are not a silver bullet, but sanctions with other diplomatic pressure, military pressure, the credible threat of military force, that is where our leverage lies. And then we need to be extremely careful about why and when we remove those sanctions. We need to use it as leverage. I cringe when I watch the US government remove sanctions before we get what we want from our adversaries. We need to get them to the point where they understand that there is no getting out of the pressure that we're putting on them unless they deliver on our demands. We have failed to do that to date. It doesn't mean that we can't do it again. And by the way, I will just say this. The narrative about whether Trump's maximum support or maximum pressure, whether that worked or it failed, it wasn't serious. We didn't push the Iranians to that place where they had to make a choice. And until you get to that place, none of it matters. The partisanship surrounding who used sanctions better, it's not a partisan issue. There is a breaking point, and you have to find it. That is how negotiations work. And if we want to win in these negotiations, if we want all of the Iranian proxies that have been funded by this regime, if we want that to stop, if we want the nuclear progress to stop, the pressure needs to be applied with other tools of American power. That would include efforts from the State Department to do things that we should have been doing a long time ago. And this is my last point, and that is that we have a long-standing dedication to trying to support democracy around the world. And yet, for some reason, we have not taken that entirely seriously as it relates to Iran. And there, I think we see something remarkable, that we've seen these protests, and you've heard a bit about them already this morning. Protests by the people of Iran who truly despise their regime and who truly resent the way in which this regime has siphoned off cash that should be going to the benefit of the people, and it has gone to groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and the 12.5 Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria. We need to support them. The maximum support to the Iranian people, coupled with maximum pressure on sanctions and the threat of military force, is ultimately what gets an adversary like Iran to reconsider its calculus. This regime has been an enemy. You've heard it from Ambassador Crocker. It's been an enemy of the United States since 1979. It has not wavered in its ideology, not during times of so-called moderates when they came to power, not so-called hardliners. I see those as distinctions without much of a difference when you ultimately have a supreme leader that still holds an ideology that views the United States as an enemy, and that doesn't waver. So we've got to think about how we want to use the elements of American power that we have. Sanctions is an important part of that. Sanctions relief can be an important part of that. But until now, I would say that the implementation of sanctions relief has actually been our worst policy, not sanctions themselves.
I think we tend to look at that question and think that it's because we've not been consistently harsh, we've not been consistently pressuring. The real consistency and the real credibility we have lost is when we have signed an agreement and then we pull out of it, because that means that we're not a trustworthy partner to actually negotiate with. And if the other side believes that we cannot be negotiated with, well, then they're going to do the things that we don't want them to do. So if we actually want to be the leader of the world, we have to have a much more nuanced view of the world, rather than thinking of it in such simplistic black and white terms and thinking that all we need to do is to just pressure the other side and it will work. That approach, frankly, is part of the reason why we have lost so much credibility in the world. That is part of the reason why we're not in the strongest position as we could be, as we should be, because we have simplified things in only to think of it in black and white. There's no nuances on the other side, and all we need to do is just to pressure and squeeze them until it works. Let me say a couple of things about the pressure and this belief that sanctions work, but sanctions relief perhaps was coming too soon, etc. First of all, the distinction that needs to be made when we talk about sanctions and whether they're working or not is to make a distinction between whether sanctions are effective and whether they're successful. Sanctions are effective in terms of imposing a cost on the other side. There's no doubt about that. The Iranian economy suffered tremendously as a result of the sanctions pressure. Effective. Successful is when the sanctions pressure translates into the desired change in policy that we want to see. If we're just imposing pain for the sake of pain and calling that working, then we're a punishing power that actually don't achieve our objectives. We have to translate that into a change in policy in the desired direction. That's when sanctions as a tool become successful. And unfortunately, in the vast majority of cases, they're not successful. We're very effective in imposing a cost, but not necessarily in actually getting the other side to change their policy. In the case of Iran, a critical thing that we're always forgetting and talking about the efficiency or success rate of working of the sanctions is that we believe that the other side just stood still and nothing happened. They just continued to do what they were doing. To simplify things, our leverage was primarily sanctions. Their leverage was the growth of their nuclear program. These two clocks were in competition with each other. During the period that the United States imposed sanctions on Iran, the Iranian nuclear program grew dramatically fast. And by January 2013, the president was faced with a choice that he would not like to have seen, which was a realization that our sanctions were not successful. The Iranian nuclear program was moving much faster than we could squeeze their economy. In January 2012, the Iranian breakout capability, the amount of time it would take for the Iranians to make a decision to build a bomb to actually having a nuclear, or the material for a nuclear weapon, was 12 months. By January 2013, a year later, the breakout capability had shrunk to 8 weeks. And the president was faced with a choice. Either we go to war, yet another war in the Middle East, another product of this black and white view of the world, or we have to accept a de facto nuclear Iran, unless we were willing to change the equation. And changing the equation meant that we were willing to look over and revise our demands on the nuclear front and actually engage in real diplomacy. And that's when the secret channel in Oman took place. And at that second meeting, the president sent Bill Burns, who's right now negotiating a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas, sent Bill Burns over to Oman to meet with the Iranians, and for the first time ever, the US side presented the Iranians with a formulation on the very strict restrictions in which we would be willing to accept their red line, which was acceptance of enrichment on their soil, but on the very, very strict restrictions. That's what opened this whole thing up. That's where the very core of the JPOA and the JCPOA actually came about. And it came about with us giving the first concessions because the president recognized that this approach of just squeezing them until they do what we want them to do is not working. Because if we were continuing on that path, they would have a bomb within a couple of months. They would have the material within a couple of weeks. And he recognized that we can't go down this path. This is the path that has led us into all kinds of unnecessary wars. And he opted for negotiations, and he opted to use the sanctions leverage to translate it into a change of policy on their end. The objective of the JCPOA was not to address all of the other negative things that Iran is engaged in, because we only had this leverage because we could work together with the rest of the P5 at the time. And the only thing the P5 could agree upon was to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. There was no agreement on human rights, was no agreements on what to do with Syria or anything like that. If we included those things onto the agenda, the Iranians would have been able to play the various parties in the P5 against each other. In order to maintain P5 unity, we had to limit it to the one issue that was existential, according to the Israelis, and at the same time, there actually could be an agreement upon. The sanctions relief was phased. None of these sanctions actually would be fully lifted until the whole JCPOA was completed. Some elements were front-loaded because some of the things the Iranians were doing were front-loaded. The principle that was used in these negotiations was reversible for reversible, irreversible for irreversible. Any concession the Iranians were to make that they could easily reverse, the US would only give a concession that we could easily reverse. When they were doing something that was much more difficult to reverse, such as ratifying the additional protocol, that's when the US actually would lift sanctions, not just waive sanctions. All of the stuff that we so far have seen is just the president every 120 or 180 days or 90 days waiving sanctions. None of the sanctions were lifted through Congress. Only when the Iranians would do something that was irreversible would we do something that were irreversible. If this process had been allowed to continue without us losing credibility by pulling out, we would be in a much better situation, not just on the nuclear front, but also on the regional front, and also on the European front. I strongly believe the Iranians would not be supporting Russia in Ukraine today if the JCPOA was still in place, and if they actually had something to lose by supporting Russia in its illegal invasion of Ukraine.
You know, this debate over the JCPOA, the reality is that 2024 is, certain things have been learned. And what's been learned on the Iranian end is their experience with the JCPOA and the ways in which the United States can sign an agreement and very quickly come out of an agreement, even if its allied partners, for example, the Europeans in the case of the JCPOA, were against it, right? So today, in considering whether more sanctions pressure or different kinds of pressure are warranted or how we go about them, I think from understanding this in a realistic sense is the fact that Iran in 2024 is different than Iran in 2011, Iran in 2012, Iran in 2013, and Iran in 2018, right? So there, even if more pressure, more sanctions are inflicted on Iran, even if there's a tightening on the the ability of the Iranians to trade on their oil to the Chinese. Iran has spent the past many years since the Obama administration onwards, actually, to be more specific, since around 2009 onwards, creating what it calls a resistance economy. Right now, economists debate quite a bit about how good or not this resistance economy is that Iran is trying to build. But what they do converge on is that the resistance economy that Iran has created, which, what does it mean? It means resistance against US sanctions. That this resistance economy has at least helped Iran's economy not crash in the same ways that Venezuela's did. So with Russia coming under the types of sanctions that it has after its invasion of Ukraine, and then on the heels of the Russia sanctions, you had situations come up in which Brazil, for example, and China make deals to trade on certain commodities and local currencies because of the weaponization of the US dollar. What you have unfolding across the world now is this realization and understanding that the weaponization of the US dollar is bad for economies, whether or not you are actually being sanctioned by the US at this current moment or not, right? Brazil and the types of arguments that it is making, certain countries in Asia, for example, Malaysia and Singapore and others are trying to trade in local currencies now, in trade across these borders because of the weaponization of the US dollar. So this is sort of going to my colleague on the left, his comments earlier about what ends up undoing the US dollar. We don't know if and when that day will come, but the fact of the increased, and the point is that since the start of the 21st century, the United States has increased sanctions by 900%. And it is a tool that sure can work, but it is a tool that we do not actually examine as much as we should for something that we utilize to the extent that we do, because there is so much backfire that happens. And I think that is something that we need to take very seriously here. Now, the other thing, in response to your direct question about consistency, I often feel like, look, I'm not in the world of policy. But I feel when I come into Washington, D.C., or since I've been here the past many years, that I am living in a Disney movie. Like, there are villains, and they're like very clear good guys, bad guys, and the world is not a Disney movie. But taking into consideration what has happened over the past 7-8 months in the Middle East, and thinking about how that has changed the reality, now going back to questions on the domestic sphere in Iran. For a very long time, for over decades, one of the leading chants of many of the protests that end up happening in Iran has been, I'll translate it to a version of, don't send our money to Gaza and Lebanon, concentrated within Iran, right? And that has been a very strong sentiment within Iranian society. There was also, in the aftermath of the 2022 uprisings in Iran, in relationship to the killing of Mahsa Amini and the Women Life Freedom movement that came about, lots of things happened. But within about a 10-month period, Iranian society was at a stage, especially among younger sectors of society, that there was this extreme, not only frustration with their government and with the regime, which is sort of a given at this stage, but that there was this strong desire to say, why are we at such a loggerheads with Israel? What is it about our relationship with Israel that has created this pariah status for us as a country? Can we figure that out? Why can we move past the Islamic Republic? Can we bring in a different kind of government that would end up, what is so bad with Israel, right? This was sort of the idea in 2023 up until, I would say, about December of 2023. Once you begin to have the daily images that are coming in, not just here and across the world, but also everyone's existing on the same internet. We're in different algorithms, but sometimes these algorithms, we bleed into one another, and people are seeing the same kinds of images. When they see these kinds of images coming out of Gaza, of what's happening there, then second upon that, you have all of these encampments taking place on US colleges. Now, you can agree with them, you can disagree with them, I don't care. But you have the very heavy-handed response that's happening to them by police forces, which when I talk to young student leaders in Iran, they're saying to me, this feels like it's Tehran. This feels like this is happening, and these feel like our uprisings and the type of police response that we get to our uprisings. So in this question of consistency, or in this question of we need to be able to pressure them in order to have them want something different, what are we giving? Part of, I think, what we have to all really contend with, but more so you all than me, I'm a researcher and I'm a scholar, but you all are the ones out in the real world doing these things, is you have to consider what is the argument that the United States now has in, as Shrita opened it up, what is it that we are now giving the rest of the world? And when it comes to questions of consistency, we are no longer consistent on human rights. We are no longer consistent on these questions on democratic rights. We are not consistent on questions of free speech. We are not consistent on questions of protest. We are not consistent on these questions that are of utmost importance to those who want change in places like Iran. And we need to be the ones to be supporting those young people and other civic activists and so forth who are at the front lines of attempting to change and wanting difference in Iran. But they are now coming up against, well, wait, the places that we look to for inspiration, we are seeing the same exact imagery as the ones that we are trying to rise up against consistently in our own sphere.
Look, in terms of consistency, I should share conversations that I've had in other parts of the Middle East as countries from the region who are deeply alarmed about the aggressive policies of the regime in Iran, the support for various terrorist factions, their dash for a nuclear weapon. What I have heard from Arab countries in the region is that they're getting whiplash. So yes, we could say that the Iranians may not trust the US because Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, which we could argue. By the way, I mean, the notion that he made the assertion that he knew that it wasn't working, I'm not sure I buy that. You know, he go around bragging about how he read the entire deal and that it was the worst deal on the planet, et cetera, et cetera. Forget that for a minute. I think we can look back in retrospect and understand that the regime was still advancing towards nuclear weapons. It was still funneling money to a bunch of different terrorist organizations. And at the end of the day, the regimes in the Middle East saw this. They understood it. And so we went from this place of the maximum pressure on the regime to maximum engagement or maximum deference, back to maximum pressure, now to, I don't even know where we are. I can't quite tell you what our policy is. It's lax enforcement of existing sanctions while the regime continues to reject any attempt to try to draw them back into new negotiations. And so the regimes in the Middle East, the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Bahrainis, even some of the other countries that are maybe more non-aligned, they're getting whiplash. And I can actually tell you, sitting with a sovereign wealth fund from one of these countries, they said, look, we respect your democracy here, but we have no idea what your policy is every 4 or 8 years. We can't figure you guys out. And so while we respect your democracy, it would be nice to see us find some middle ground, right? That the idea is that foreign policy in this country, I think, has always been successful when it represents centrist thinking. And I think we're missing that right now. I mean, there is no centrist thinking in this town, as I think many people can probably acknowledge. We've become deeply polarized. But once upon a time, it didn't really matter whether a Democrat or a Republican was in the White House because our foreign policy as it related to the Cold War was relatively consistent. And that was actually very helpful in maintaining the alliance structures that were crucial to building the post-war US-led world order. And that is what is unraveling right now. And so I'm less concerned about how the Iranians view this. I'm more concerned about how our allies in the region, as we continue to struggle to hold together the Middle East with duct tape right now, we have lost them. They don't trust that we're not going to start swinging wildly back and forth, and then they're beginning to hedge their bets. But let me just, one last note here. I want to get back to this idea of the implementation of sanctions relief, because I think it's really important. When we talk about what happened in 2013 and 2015 and the sanctions relief that we began to provide the regime for fear that they would march toward that nuclear weapon, you got to remember what we did with the amount of money that we spent, the billions of dollars that we released from escrow and that we provided to the regime. Our thinking, yes, at the time, it was going to be that we were going to get ourselves out of this predicament where we're on a collision course with the region. That was really the thinking. We don't want another disastrous Middle East war. Fine. I mean, I understand that, and that's where the American public was back then. It's probably where the American public is now. But look at where we are now. After providing billions and billions of dollars to this regime, and knowing that, yeah, maybe they paused their nuclear program for a time, but now they're back at it again. Okay, you want to blame us for getting out? You want to blame Trump for getting out of the deal? Okay, fine. But what about the fact that we have an administration right now that would love to get back into a deal and the regime doesn't care? The regime is still driving ahead to that nuclear precipice, and there's nothing that anybody can do to stop that. So we're back to square one on that, and the regime doesn't seem to want to talk. But then in the meantime, the money that we provided the regime, that money has flowed to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, to the Shiite militias across the Middle East. We're talking about $200 million a year, give or take, to Hamas that flowed throughout this time period. $800 million a year that flowed to Hezbollah. Another $10, $20, $30 million that went to the Houthis each year and has grown incrementally over time. And by the way, the Houthis are a laboratory for the use of weapons that the Iranian regime is developing. And then there's untold millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions that have gone to these PMUs, the Popular Mobilization Units across Iraq and Syria. What we've done by trying to kick the can down the road on a possible conflict with Iran, we're now seeing that they've just started another war by proxy. And the entire region is on fire because of the regime in Iran. Every one of the groups right now, including the ones that have killed American soldiers, they are funded by this regime with money that we have provided them over time. It is a mistake to give a regime like Iran sanctions relief. It is dangerous to do that because you cannot say, here's money just for your social services, here's money just for your bridges and hospitals. They don't care. They're going to spend the money as they wish. And that was a fundamental mistake in our sanctions relief.
My name is Richard Hallwell. I was ambassador in Ecuador, but for the last 20 years, I've been doing a lot of trade work. And it's apparent to me that there's a network of preferential trade under the WTO umbrella. There are about 385 bilateral and regional trade agreements. Many of these are using local currency. The Chinese are leading the way in that regard. How long do you think it is that we can maintain the primacy of the US dollar?
It's a great question. I'll take a first stab at it. The short answer is I don't know, primarily because of our own debt. That's our biggest problem, is the value of the dollar right now as we continue to borrow, and you can just watch that deficit balloon. How long can the dollar be trusted in that sense? But now let's take a look at some of the other currencies. Okay, the euro, I'm not sure anybody's going to start really, backing their major transactions with the euro. I'm not sure that it's trusted in that way. And we've seen, by the way, if in war zones, for example, which is a fascinating test case, nobody wants euros. They want dollars, right? I mean, just even in the most basic terms, there's what you trust and there's what you don't. But the big question is whether it's the RMB that could potentially eclipse this. By the way, it cannot be crypto. I think we've seen the collapse of cryptocurrencies and the disasters that's come out of that. At least in their current iteration, I don't see it, right? But then it's the RMB that I think is the big question, because it's not going to be the ruble. I mean, that's out of the question, right? So it's the RMB that we're talking about for right now. The big thing that I've heard recently is that the Belt and Road Initiative and the corruption that has come along with Chinese investment and the poor practices exhibited by the Chinese regime, it's not just what the currency is worth. It's what the government that stands behind that currency, what their policies are on a fiscal basis, financially. Are they trustworthy in business? And China has failed in that regard until now. They are not a peer, they're not an equal with the US in the eyes of most legitimate governments. Not all, but most. And I think it's for that reason that the dollar still has a runway. But we need to get that debt in control so that people can trust the dollar, not just the government that stands behind it, but what the currency is worth based on math.
This goes back to the question of our consistency. The trade in dollars stood above 70% year 2000. It's down to 59% of global trade right now. That is a very significant reduction. I don't think we're going to see any other currency that is going to be as strong as the dollar in the near future. But the use of the dollar is likely going to continue to go down. And a very, very big reason for that, according to Jonathan's colleagues at the Treasury, is the use of financial sanctions, because it adds a completely different level of risk to trade. In many ways, dollar is the safest one, but politically, because of the use of sanctions, it is not. Let me give an example. We managed within 5 days to cut Russia off of the financial grid. Much deserved, mindful of what Russia had done, one could argue, but he also sent shockwaves throughout the rest of the world, because of the fact that the United States is not seen as a consistent actor and is not seen as a country that necessarily always elects the most reasonable presidents. And this meant that a lot of countries that are good friends of the United States started to become very worried. What happens if a future president of the United States finds a major problem with their country? And many of our close allies should be worried, frankly, mindful of what they are doing. But it leads to a situation in which many of them want to start hedging and use less and less of the dollar in case they run afoul of the United States, because no other country has the power to be able to cut off another country within 5 days from the international system. It's very effective in terms of imposing cost on that country, but it also has the side effect of making sure that those countries then want to find a way to hedge against that pain that we could potentially impose on them. And that is a key reason as to why we have seen the reduction of the use of dollar. And I suspect it will continue. I don't see the Chinese or any other currency replacing the US, but the US's domination is likely going to continue to.
A couple of things. One conclusion I draw from the panel's observation is that if people are going to use alternative currency to begin to try to evade sanctions, and they trade in their own local currencies and successfully, that means they're going to keep on building on that, which would have do more trade in local currencies with each other, which would undermine the American dollar. Well, I want to ask a specific question at a Trump world, and that is the criticism of the JCPOA. The criticisms that I heard and that I understood was, number one, to continue to work with that, we had to give them all this money, which I think most people believe was really stupid, and I think that you've concurred with that. Secondly, and the big kahuna, that I understood that the JCPOA had sunset clauses, which meant that all the opposition had to do was wait us out. Just wait. They don't care what kind of presidents we elect, who it is. Just let the program do what it is designed to do, which is to let them just wait until the sunset clauses kick in. Then they just keep on building their nuclear bombs. And we said it was okay. That's pretty. And finally, it seems to me that everything we do is based upon the American political concept of goodwill, which is that you do something nice for me, I'll do something nice for you. So we keep on doing nice things for all these people, and they don't care because they don't live within that world. So those are my observations. My central question is, did the JCPOA ever make any sense? Ever? And I think a lot of politicians concluded it didn't. And that's why we got out.
First of all, I can't say I disagreed with anything you said, except for your first point. The local trade as a means of evading sanctions. People don't want to be holding, I don't know, dinars from a country that maybe they don't want to do trade with, right? And so there's a limit to how much you're going to want to do trade bilaterally in someone else's currency unless they have something that you really need. And at the end of the day, if what you're looking for is a ubiquitous currency, one that can be accepted worldwide in good faith, it's the dollar or the euro. And that's pretty much it. Nobody wants yen, nobody wants RMB, nobody wants ruble. That's just not how the system works right now. People want to have cash reserves, and they want that cash to be something that can be used anywhere. And the dollar is still that, and that is the key to understanding why we still have leverage in this system right now and why it's important. We're the primary. We're not the only, but we're the primary. People keep talking about baskets of currencies and things like that, blending currencies together. None of that has worked so far. Crypto hasn't worked so far. Attempted challengers of the US system have not worked so far. It helps that we created the system, right? And it also helps that we still, even with all of our flaws and all of our problems, we still have a government that people trust because the core principles, the system, remains the same. Now, got to hold on to that, right? We got, and we got some tests coming up in November without question, but that's the important thing to understand. And as long as there is trust in this system, we're going to still have that leverage, and that's why sanctions will continue to work and why we will be able to continue to impose our will should we wish to do so. Now, as for the deal itself, look, I've already talked about the sanctions relief and the major flaws and the blowback that we're experiencing this day with the amount of chaos that the regime has created around the region. That is a direct result of the sanctions relief that we provided. But then there is the other part of it, which is exactly your point. The sunset clauses afforded the regime a patient pathway to be able to wait out the West, while, by the way, accepting money from us, the goodwill that you discussed, dispersing it around the region to the various malign actors that are waging war right now and potentially drawing us in to a regional war, and we're shedding money because of the Red Sea, because of the deployment of our Navy. This is all due to the Iranians who could wait out the US on this. We did, again, I'll just say this, we did not use our leverage properly. You don't give concessions until you get what you want. And what we should have demanded back then was a total cessation of all terrorist groups around the region, all non-state actors, and then on top of that, a permanent end to the nuclear program. We got neither out of that. I believe the Iranians fleeced the Obama administration. They stole everything, not just their wallet, their pants. And we are now in a position where we're still trying to figure out how to get back into that driver's seat. And that is that fatal flaw of the 2015 nuclear deal that you mentioned.
I have to respond to this one, please. Otherwise, I will walk away here very disappointed. So, first of all, the money that Iran received was Iran's money. Jonathan made it sound as if we gave our money to them. That is not the case. US sanctions meant that we had frozen Iranian assets in foreign banks, South Korean banks and other banks. Their own money was released back to them. Yes, a lot of it, because we had frozen a lot of it. What we're not hearing is what the Iranians did in return, which makes the idea that this was some sort of a bad deal quite laughable. 98% of their low-enriched uranium was shipped out and under control of the IAEA. They had 22,000 centrifuges, 19,000 of them which were functioning. That was reduced down to only 5,000. At no point would the Iranians be able to have more than 300 kilos of low-enriched uranium. You need 1,200 kilos of low-enriched uranium to build one bomb. They would never have enough material for a single bomb on their territory as a result of the JCPOA. 14 times in a row did the IAEA, the institute that is overlooking all of this, certified that the Iranians were living up to the agreement completely. Completely. Twice, the State Department under Trump certified that the Iranians were living up to the agreement. There were no sunset clause of that term. All arms controls agreements at the end of the day have certain things that go off. The one thing that is crucial with this agreement was that the most important aspect of it never went off, which is the inspections regime. The IAEA would be inside every aspect of Iran's nuclear program forever. And the Iranians would sign the additional protocol and ratify it. They already were implementing it from the very beginning when the deal came in voluntarily, and there would be a complete ratification of it, which meant that as long as the deal was allowed to survive, with Trump not pulling out, the Iranians would never be able to make a decision to go for a bomb without the IAEA and US intelligence detecting it within hours. And we would have far more intelligence on all of their nuclear facilities, which actually would make, if it ever came to that point, any effort to take military action much easier, precisely because of the depth of the inspections and the penetration of the IAEA into the nuclear program. All of that has been lost as a result of Trump leaving that deal. And we are now far closer. Right now, I think the estimate is about 7 days for the Iranians to have enough material for a nuclear bomb. All of a result of maximalist approaches, saying, oh, this is a bad deal because we didn't get everything we wanted. When on earth did a functioning deal lead to a situation in which one side gets everything it wants and the other side gets to capitulate everything it wants, short of an actual war? That has never happened. So if you want war, then we should just say it. Let's go to war. But if you want to avoid another war in the Middle East, reality is we're going to have to compromise. And this was the best possible compromise we could have gotten in 2013. I do believe that we could have gotten a better compromise. But that would have come if we in 2005, 2007, 2009, instead of believing that the sanctions would bring the Iranians to their knees, we actually had struck a compromise then, we would have gotten a much better deal for a very simple reason. They had less leverage because they had less time to develop their nuclear program. They had less centrifuges, they had not done 20% enrichment of uranium. All of these things that gave them leverage, that got them a deal that was better than they could have gotten in 2005 and 2007, happened during the time in which our policy was centered on sanctions. We lost time and we lost leverage.
$100 billion though went to Hamas.
No, $100 billion did not go to Hamas. US intelligence came out and made an estimation that the vast majority of that money had gone into Iran itself because of the regime's
And
internal
then
problems.
exported
However,
out again
no,
to
hold on.
exactly these
but
groups.
they also, money certainly has gone to some of these other groups. There is no other proposal that would have stopped that short of war. So you have to actually ask yourself, is that what you want? Or just to be able to criticize this deal? Reality.
Iran was not honoring the deal anyway. Iran was not allowing the inspections. They were cheating on the deal.
That is completely false. The IAEA is the arbiter of this. 14 times in a row, they certified. They certainly did. This is not a point of opinion. This is a point of fact. The IAEA certified it 14 times. After the Trump administration pulled out, at that point, when the US no longer was honoring the agreement, the Iranians also pulled out. But as long as we were honoring it, so were they. We can change, try to live in a fantasy world where we're going to end up not being able to strike any more deals with any parties in the world, and it's going to put the United States in a much, much worse situation.